As I said before, I am Sydney Sims, and I am so happy to be here with you all. I am Outreach Coordinator for the Brechner Freedom of Information Project at the University of Florida. So we're so gracious and happy to see each of you who have joined us for the first Sunshine Fest. So you all should give yourselves a round of applause for being here, because I would like to again thank all of my colleagues, Dave, Diana, Abby, Chris, Jillian, Tara, everyone who's helped, and so many more, if I did not name you, who's helped make this event great. And so one of the stories that we're going to hear today all of the stories that you're going to hear today are extremely inspiring, but also insightful into why this work matters. And I know a large part of why each of you are here today is to show your advocacy in this community, and a great way of understanding how that advocacy works and seeing how that change has been incited in communities around this country. And so our panelists today are going to tell amazing stories about how they were able to do this work in their communities and how it has incited change in their lives. And we're so happy to be able to share these stories. We're so gracious to have our experts on the panel, to have our individual Sunshine Week champions that we featured this week, and we're extremely proud to be able to, I'm extremely proud to be able to sit here with these women. So just to give you a brief overview of the panelists before you today, we have Laura Neuman, a senior advisor at the Carter Center, sitting right next to me. Right next to Laura is Samantha Sam Satterly. She is our 2025 FOI champion with the University of Louisville. Right next to Sam is Chelsea Curtis. She is a reporter and a 2025 FOI champion with the Arizona Luminaria. And all the way down to the end is Sheila Albers, also another 2025 FOI champion from Overland Park, Kansas. So we're going to start today. Our panel is going to be kind of moderated by myself. We'll do our big picture analysis, why this work really matters. Laura will take us through that, tell us how the Carter Center has been instrumental in inspiring some of these stories globally and what that looks like and why this work really matters on the ground. After that, you'll hear from our FOI champions. And at the end, we'll have time where you guys can ask questions about the stories you heard today. So Laura, tell us why this matters. Tell us about the work that the Carter Center is doing and what it means to really champion freedom of information.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. And if you're still eating, please continue to do so. I first want to start by thanking the Brechner Center, David, his whole team, and everybody who put this together. It's amazing to come together as a community of people who really do care about the right to information. And I would be reticent if I didn't say hello to so many old friends here. I haven't seen many of you for years. And so thanks, David, for the homecoming. We really appreciate this opportunity to be together again. Hard times, we always have to look to community, and that's what we are. Just quickly, the Carter Center is, for those of you who don't know, it's a non-governmental organization. It was founded by former President Jimmy Carter and his wife Rosalind, when he used to like to say, when he was forcibly retired from the White House, he was still very young and wanted to continue his life's work, much of which was around issues like human rights, transparency, good governance, and democracy. And so that's a lot of what we do, and that's much of what I do at the Carter Center. So I've been there 25 years, and I started at the Carter Center, having practiced law representing people under the poverty line, and doing that, you quickly realize how important public records are. You need those really to make sure that your clients get all of the benefits, for example, that they're due. And I took that idea into the Carter Center, recognizing that while it is an incredibly potent tool for accountability and fighting corruption, it's equally important for the exercise of fundamental rights. And having done it for a few years, maybe a few years too many, before we realized that there was a problem, that for many people in our communities, they weren't able to exercise their right to information. And so let me start by telling you the story of Ana. Ana is from Guatemala City. Ana had been married to an abusive husband who died. She was left alone with her two daughters and unable to care for them properly. And so she fell into a very deep depression. She stopped eating herself so that she could feed her teenage daughters. And she was literally on the street dying when a neighbor came up to her and said, "Ana, why aren't you getting help?" And she said, "Well, what do you mean help? And she said, you are in front of a women's center that is run by the city. And this women's center provides free healthcare, free medicine, psychosocial supports. They can help take care of you and your children. And she had no idea that this existed. And she had no idea because she didn't have the information. And so we always say information doesn't matter if people don't have it. And so that was really kind of one of the starting points to thinking about why are women often and marginalized populations being excluded from information flows? Why is it so much more difficult for them to access information than it is others? And so we had held a big conference. Actually, there's a colleague here from Accra, from the Information Commission. Our conference had actually, one of them years ago had been in Accra. And for every woman we invited to the conference, she substituted herself with a man. And President Carter actually was leading it and stood up and said, why are all the women here, mostly those that I brought with me? You know, what's happening? And so we said, look, there must be an inequity. And he challenged me to prove it. Again, remember, I'm a lawyer, not a social scientist. So I turned to one of my favorite social scientists, which is Suzanne Piotrowski, who's here with us. And she helped me create a study that we actually have applied in 4 different countries, 2,000 interviews, and we were able to demonstrate the hypothesis that women really are excluded and marginalized people from information flows for all the reasons that you as people who work in this field know, whether it's lack of awareness that their right exists, they don't know how to ask or where to go, they don't have time or mobility, someone in their community or their family or the public servant doesn't support a woman asking a question, asking that to power. You know, cultural norms, illiteracy, digital divide, you name it, it impacts them. And so the Carter Center decided to try to address that issue with some long-term programming, which I'm going to give you 2 more stories, as well as a campaign that I'm running called the Inform Women, Transform Lives campaign. And we work right now in 35 global cities around the world. We're adding 10 more as we speak, about 10 more. And we really work with city governments. By 2050, 70% of our world is going to be urban. So if we want to talk about where democracy needs to deliver, it's at the city level. And so we work with these city governments to what we talked about earlier, proactive disclosure, to identify services that they have that women are largely not accessing because of a lack of information, whether that's the healthcare that Anna needed, or I'm going to tell you a story about Salima in a second, or economic empowerment, waste management, gender-based violence. So we work with them and we also do some long-term programming to help women overcome these obstacles and also to support governments to get closer to their communities, to their citizens with this information. So this is a quick story about Salima. Salima's from Bangladesh. She's from a place called Sylhet. And Salima had a 7-year-old son with cerebral palsy. And she was working, but not making enough money for the care that he needed. And so much like Anna, she didn't know where to go. And she was in a village courtyard meeting where one of my colleagues was talking about the right to information and that she could ask her government about services. So she had some incredible gumption and she went to her local government and said, my son has cerebral palsy. I'm not able to care for him. Please tell me what to do. And of course, it turned out that they had services. And so she took the information that she received through a FOIA request and was able to get the services that her child needed. I know you guys have the best story, so I'm gonna give one more story, and this is one of my favorite ladies. Her name is Olivia. She's from Liberia, which is in West Africa. And Olivia actually heard about information on the radio. So we were working with governments there, recognizing that women don't have time to go to agencies. They often don't have the capacity to get there, whether it's money or ability. It's sometimes unsafe for women to travel in public spaces, depending on where you're working. So we said to the government, let's use some different mechanisms to reach women. And so they actually started putting information out through their community radio. And she heard about a program for economic empowerment, and she used the right to information to get more details about how to apply for that. And she ended up applying for a grant to make soap. She was successful. She took her earnings and turned it into a savings and loan situation where then she gave grants to 50 other women with support from the community development funds, and they gave loans to others. And as you can imagine, there's now hundreds of women in that community in Liberia who've gotten loans and paid them back so that others could start small businesses. And so I know when we talk about freedom of information, often we think of like national information, you know, and I was amazed by the woman. I hope she's still here. I wrote her name down. Megan Ryan from Virginia. Are you still here? Awesome, Megan. So sucking the life out of FOIA. That is going to be a phrase that I repeat often. And you are 100% right, because we all think about this oftentimes as even at the state level or at the national level, that it's this big information people want, right? They want information about national policy and big budgets and what's going on with our security. But when we ask women and marginalized people, what information do you want? That's not it. They want local information that's going to change their lives. And so I know my time is up. You are going to hear some incredible stories from people in your communities here in the United States and what they've done. But just in closing, I just want to encourage all of us. It is a time where people are concerned. We're all scared and frustrated, regardless of where you are in the world. I think our world is changing fast with AI and technology and politics, but there are hopeful signs and ways to hope. And I think it's really when you think about someone like Olivia, where she just used the Freedom of Information law in her small community in Liberia and changed the lives of her entire community. So thank you to all of you for what you're doing to change people's lives. And I can't wait to join Sydney and hear of others that are doing that. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much. Such a beautiful story of just realizing, I think the biggest takeaway that I heard you say is we are so disconnected from each other more than ever. And ironically, we're more connected than we probably have ever been as a community. And even gathering here today, so many of you have been apart for so long, and it's such a beautiful thing to be able to see your community, people you probably haven't seen off of Zoom in many, many years. And so it touched me in hearing how you said, you know, a part of that community is your right to know. And you deserve that right to know. You deserve the right to know what's happening in your community. And so kind of taking it back a little bit to COVID, I'm pretty sure a lot of people in this room can relate to maybe finding a new self-renaissance during COVID. And so, Sam, when we talked about your story, you kind of went through that renaissance through COVID, where you were working and kind of had this like complete career change that led you down this path to finding a paper trail in your community that revealed a very toxic secret. So could you just tell me more about that self-renaissance?
Absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Sam Satterly. And in 2021, I was enrolled in my first semester of the Sustainability Master's Program at the University of Louisville in Kentucky. And admittedly, I had no idea what I was doing. One of my professors had mentioned the Valley of the Drums EPA Superfund site, which I had never heard of, but it sounded like it would make a good thesis. At the time, I was working part-time at my local library, which just so happened to serve as the repository for the Valley of the Drums. So that's where I started. About a year into my research, I was offered a position with Louisville Metro government, working for the Parks and Rec Department, located in Jefferson Memorial Forest, which I happily accepted. Then one night, while sifting through the records at the repository, I came across a document from 1992, which mentioned the existence of more drums located just outside the boundary of the Valley of the Drums Superfund site in a forested area. That's when I decided to do an open records request with the state of Kentucky, and the files that I received led me down a rabbit hole. I found document after document that insisted that these two sites were separate, even though they were in such close proximity and they were similar in nature. The site was dubbed the Gully of the Drums. You can see on the map, it was less than 1,000 feet from the Valley of the Drums. At that point, I decided to do a FOIA request with the EPA, and in my request, I expanded the time frame beyond the EPA's official timeline, which you can see on the slide. I ended up finding evidence that Jefferson County was in negotiations with the operator of the Valley of the Drums in order to lease a portion of Jefferson Memorial Forest to be utilized as a municipal dump. Unfortunately, the property that Jefferson County agreed to lease didn't actually belong to Jefferson County. It belonged to a family by the name of Stover. After the Stovers discovered the waste on their property, they decided to take Jefferson County to court, and they won. As a result, Jefferson County was ordered to clean up the site, which unfortunately never happened. After the Stovers passed away, the heirs to the Stover property attempted to sell the land, but they were unsuccessful because the waste that still remained on site. As a result, they ended up donating the land to Jefferson County, which was then used to expand municipally owned Jefferson Memorial Forest, where I lived. After I pieced this story together, I approached my supervisors and shared the information with them. And I was told in no uncertain terms to keep my mouth shut because this was not something that we wanted to go public with. And as it turns out, I was not a very good employee because that's exactly what I did. I shared my research with everyone, anyone that would listen. State and local officials, journalists, media outlets, everyone. And the story thankfully blew up. As a result, in June 2024, Global Metro Council passed a resolution to allocate $68,000 for an environmental investigation into the Gully of the Drums in Jefferson Memorial Forest. Once that resolution was passed, I resigned from my position. It was obvious to me that our values were grossly misaligned. And I'm grateful to say today that just a few weeks ago, the investigation was concluded and a remediation plan is in the works right now. Thank you.
Sam, I did want to point out that there is a QR code. Sam actually created a story map that is online, and you can check out this data, all of these Mirandas that she found, the great photos, the maps that she created. So if you want to get that right now, that QR code is on this slide, and I'll give you a few seconds to grab that. Right. And of course, we'll have time for questions at the end, so I hope you guys are thinking of great ones. But Sam, that is an amazing story of how you, in the repository of the library, who would have ever thought? And that can show you how accessible records can truly be on the local level. You know, sometimes it takes just simply going into those. I know how many of us have dusted off a book in a while, but this is a room of academics, so and advocates, y'all probably dust off books a lot. But we can go to our local libraries and check out things like repositories and find that information that's right in our community. So that was an amazing and such a unique way to lead into uncovering something right in yours. So we're so proud. Thank you so much for sharing your story. And so next, I would like to jump over to Chelsea, Chelsea, your outfit is beautiful today. And I can say it's beautiful with intention because the more I've talked to you, I've realized how intentional your decisions have always been with the work that you're going to share with us. And so Chelsea had the opportunity to create a database of missing and murdered women, transgender women, and two-spirited people in Arizona. And she gathered that data to really shed light on her community, you know? So, and I know your outfit was intentional. So tell us about the choice of why you chose to dress in the attire you've chosen for today.
Hi, hi. Chelsea Curtis, Inisha, Tora Chini Nishle, Bilagana Bashashin, Tatnasani Dashache, Bilagana Dashanele. I just introduced myself to you in my Navajo language. I am an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation in Arizona. I've been a journalist in Arizona for a decade and kind of covered all kinds of things across the state. And so, but Indigenous communities was always near and dear to me, obviously, and I've always wanted to do some reporting related to Indigenous communities. Arizona has 22 federally recognized tribes. And yeah, so that's why I, dove into this project. So I want to share a quote with you. When an Indigenous woman goes missing, she goes missing twice. First, her body vanishes, then her story. This was a quote that was told to me by Yolanda Baidoni, whose cousin, Keisha Kutzwaytawa, went missing from the Navajo Nation 3 years ago in this March. And it really gets to the heart of why I wanted to do this project, because, so many Indigenous women, their stories are lost when they do go missing, and they're kind of overlooked, and even by news organizations. And that was really why I wanted to do this project, to share those stories, because I've just heard anecdotally from families who want to share but just aren't given that spotlight. And so that's why I took on this project. Data on MMIP is it's not really compiled in any official way. And so I knew public records would give me a lot of these answers. And so I filed over 100 public records requests to various law enforcement agencies in the state. And there are many that are still, in process. And those helped me to find, tell stories like Ria Almeida, who was 7 years old when she was murdered in Arizona. She's a member of the Thanatham Nation, and her mom, Elaine, has dove into advocacy, and she is now like an MMIP advocate. And she graciously shared her story with me, which is really tough. But she is very brave to share her story. And public records, helped me write that story, but it also helped me just find people that, the public just doesn't know about, cases that they're not aware of. For example, Lori Longchase. She was a San Carlos Apache teenager who went missing for over 40 years ago in the Phoenix area. And there was like no information about, anything related to her. And I started asking questions, and all of a sudden there was a break in her case, and she was identified and matched through DNA testing to remains that were found murdered 40 years ago as well. So for 40 years, she was missing to her family, and no one knew her story. And but she also was just an unidentified person that happened to be murdered around the same time, and nobody knew. And so it was really, really impactful to be able to share that story and finally, find her family and, put her, reclaim her name for her. And so the database also is a big part of this. There, again, isn't really a lot of data about this, and it's a work in progress. But so far, based on the public records and what I've been able to verify, there are just under 100 women and girls reflected. And this is just some of the data points that I was able to put together. So between women and girls 19 to 32 years old accounted for 40% of the deaths on the database, and then 45% of the missing people. And then nearly half of the women that were murdered were mothers. And I think that's an important statistic to focus on, because intergenerational trauma is very alive in communities of color and Indigenous communities. And so if you're having half of these cases where mothers are being murdered, I think that that's leaving a lasting impact on their families and continuing that intergenerational trauma. I also found, or the data showed, that about 45% of the cases were linked to substance abuse, and or intimate partner violence. These seem to be, a lot of the root causes of the cases that are on there now. And so, my goal obviously was to share the stories first and foremost, but I also wanted to showcase and make data accessible in a way that really hasn't been done before and easy for people to understand so that Indigenous communities, Indigenous leaders, and they can, hold themselves accountable, hold their, their leadership accountable, but also maybe drive change and, more resources for families. And this is a little snippet of it includes a map, and then there's a QR code there too. Oh, and I also wanted to say, Arizona Luminaria hired me for this position, and they went to bat for me to get this project started. We're a nonprofit newsroom in Arizona, fairly new. And they partnered with International Women's Media Foundation's Fund for Indigenous Journalists and the Data Driven Reporting Project to, help support everything. So thankful to them. Thank you.
Sharing that story. I know one of the things we talked about when I interviewed you for the Sunshine Week profile was not only did you have to go through the difficulty of gathering state records from Arizona entities, but you had to go through tribal records. And that was a piece of work in itself because as sovereign nations, they don't necessarily have the same freedom of information laws. I know we talked a lot about even just the mistrust between government entities and the community. And so you're kind of on like this two-sided line as an Indigenous person yourself, where you're being an advocate for access to information, but also being query and respectful and genuine with your community and understanding that mistrust is rightfully placed. And so I did want to, of course, Chelsea mentioned it, but this woman sat in an interview with the Arizona Luminaria and told them, this is the project I want to do, until they went to bat and gave her this job for this project. So that is an amazing thing. So Chelsea, thank you so much for sharing that beautiful story. And something you touched on was a lot about motherhood in your conversation. And Laura touched on this too, about how motherhood oftentimes creates advocates. And our last FOI champion, who's going to share a tragic story that she was able to incite change, not only in her family, but in her state, was really a story of a mother who had to turn into an advocate overnight. So Sheila, tell us about your son, John.
Hi, I'm Sheila Albers. This is a picture of myself and my eldest son, John. My husband and I adopted John from Minsk, Belarus when he was 18 months old. He did have that white blonde hair and he had the most ice blue eyes. I'm a mom, I'm a former public educator. I was a middle school principal for 13 years. I have two other sons, one adopted from Russia, and then my third son was a biological surprise. I always call him my punchline. Sydney is correct that motherhood is what drove me into advocacy. John was a pretty typical kid in the sense he loved sports. School was good for him. He had ADHD and it didn't surprise me because he had a ton of energy. But it was in 8th grade-ish when we noticed that there was kind of an uptick in some behavior that caused us concern. And John was struggling with some mental health issues. And so we were getting him help and I think doing the best that we knew to do for him. But his junior year on January 20th of 2018, really the unthinkable happened. John went to get recertified to be a soccer ref because that's what he loved, and he ref soccer games for $25 a game. He thought that was big money. And while he was at the sporting goods store taking the class, he decided to shoplift. And he shoplifted some items, don't know why. It had not been his first encounter with law enforcement because of his mental health struggles. My husband picked him up, and we were obviously pretty angry at him for making such a poor decision. And he was going to be grounded. That evening, we were scheduled to go out to dinner with some friends and with extended family. We invited him to go with us. He chose not to go. He stayed home. And not long after we left, he started to post some suicidal type comments on Snapchat. His friends did the right thing. They called 911 and 2 officers showed up at our home. My husband, myself, and my other 2 boys were about 15 minutes away. John attempted to leave our house with my minivan keys. John was in the garage with the car on. The 2 officers chatted on the driveway very briefly. One ran to his car to get his phone, and the other one oddly took a defensive position behind a tree. Then the officer walked towards our driveway. He watched our garage door slowly open. John pulls the car out of the garage at 2.5 miles per hour in a straight line. The officer yells, "Stop," and fires 2 of 13 rounds into our minivan. The minivan rolls down the driveway and kind of turns around. The officer fires 11 more shots. 6 of the 13 hit John, and he died almost instantaneously. This is the media release that came out from the Overland Park Police Department. That is the municipality I live in. And I became very familiar very quickly that we do have a national problem with local government. And I don't say just police, because I think city councils and district attorneys are equal participants in this, but they put out false narratives. And so they use the words rapidly and aggressively coming out of the driveway, when in fact the car was coming out at 2.5 miles per hour. They quickly, and I mean quickly, put a playbook into place so that the victim is painted in the most negative light and the officer can be cleared of any misconduct. This is the digital recreation next to it is from the Washington Post that did a really excellent mini documentary on my son in 2022 to show that the narrative put out by the local police department and then the DA contradict the forensic evidence available in the case. We filed a civil lawsuit. It settled in 2019. It settled before we ever hit discovery. I very intentionally did not sign an NDA because I wanted to tell John's story as soon as the litigation was over. And I also proceeded to put in a ton of open records requests. Mark Schmidt is a retired attorney and a member of my extended family. He taught me how to write KORA requests, and I have to give a shout out to him because I didn't even know what a KORA request was. But our KORA request found, we busted the police chief in a lie. We found out that the district attorney ruled the case justified before all the crime lab information was even back in the district attorney's possession. We used open records and an online database to discover the $70,000 that was given to the officer to get him to resign. We discovered that $70,000 severance payment June of 2020, so a year and a half after John was killed. That severance payment triggered a U.S. Department of Justice civil rights investigation that took 2 years. The officer was not indicted, but the DOJ did release a 2-page narrative to correct the information around John's death. Open records has also then helped expose the process where police officers who've done some sort of misconduct can easily jump to another municipality. We've been able to tighten up things at the state level regarding that. We have in Overland Park, I'm very proud of this, we have a police transparency page now where everything, policies, procedures, manuals are all online for the community. We are the only municipality in the state of Kansas that has that. I finally got the district attorney to put a manual up on his website on how officer-involved shootings are investigated. It took him 5 years to do it, but it is up there. My continued advocacy work is helping other families who've been in the same position as we have to push for greater transparency. There is a book that has been written. It's called Mothers in Arms, And it is about myself and my good friend Maureen Stokes. Her son was killed by KCPD in 2013. And it really highlights the importance of transparency and the power that ordinary citizens, and especially mothers, can have regarding FOIA.
Sheila, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. One of the things I was always so grateful for is that we actually have student workers in the Brechner Center, and Sheila was so gracious to allow Abby, who's here with us today, to interview her and have the opportunity to hear that story and get real world work. And so one of the things we talked about extensively, I know when I first reached out to you, we've had so many conversations about John. And what has always been apparent to me was you were always going to fight for him. And it's something that I can appreciate in your story, and all of these stories was just the fight for community. And I think that's so important in these days. And these profiles, if you're interested in continuing to read them, they are currently published on our Sunshine Week website. There's a QR code if you would like to read them after the conference, when you take some time to debrief. If you're on your plane ride home tonight, you can check out all the links to these stories, their stories, all the databases, the story maps, and be able to come back to this because again, a big part of Sunshine Week and a big part of FOI and a big part of this community needs to be shining light on those who are doing the local work that matters. Because without it, what are we doing this for? What's the point? So thank you, ladies. This panel was beautiful. It was intentionally women. That was intentional. And so we can take questions. I'm sure there are some. There are none. We can start with questions, but if anybody does have a question, just please raise your hand and I'll come around with the mic. Sure.
While y'all are thinking about your questions, so I think I mentioned I've been doing this for 25 years. This is truly one of the most inspiring panels I've been able to sit on. So I want to take the three of you everywhere I go. In fact, we're going to Nairobi tomorrow. I'm going to Nairobi. Are you available? And thank you, Sydney. And this is amazing. Like so rarely do we get to actually hear from the requesters and what it's done to change policy and change communities and support the rest of us. So truly, this has been amazing. And I needed this. I think we all needed this, right? So thank you all.
Question. You can just say your name.
Alex Howard, thank you all for coming and sharing your stories with us here and everyone else around the country or world to learn from you. I guess the question I'd have is straightforward. What do you wish you'd known before you started this process that you'd like everyone listening to benefit? Because you've obviously all gone through a process and learning from your wisdom and lived experience might help other people who didn't have to go through that walk.
So I'm not, previously, I guess now I'm a data reporter, but before that, my background wasn't in data reporting. But I did pull from previous experiences of covering up police shootings actually, and, maintaining a sort of database related to that. But so I went into this basically just, trying to figure it out on my own while still doing reporting. And so I wish if I could go back, I would do more project planning, maybe, asking a guiding question, just kind of like centering myself a little bit more. I obviously knew what I wanted to do, but I think just it would have helped to be a little more organized, I guess, because sometimes it was just like so many things to juggle that it could get a little chaotic with, over 100 requests. And then I think, looping in experts from the beginning also is helpful. I ended up doing that kind of near like the end of it before we launched. And I wish I got more like insight from a data expert because it really, helped me, fix things that like I just wasn't aware of. And then looping in public records experts, sometimes I ran into hurdles. And and so, looping those experts in sooner was, obviously really helpful. And so doing that earlier would have been probably better.
So I think for me, and I understand this is going to sound very naive to a lot of you, would be keeping my expectations lower for folks who work in local government. I think I just expected to be able to say, hey, here's what I found, and let's find a solution. And more often than not, you find that people are more concerned with their reputation, with their ego, as opposed to doing the right thing. So that's what I would like to tell myself.
I would say, don't hesitate to ask questions. I think that it feels daunting and that it's easy to be intimidated by the system, by local government, and not ask the questions. And I would tell people, don't hesitate, ask the question. I'm not a reporter, I'm not an attorney. I mean, I'm a public educator. And someone today said, FOIA is for everyone, and FOIA is for everyone. It is, and we need to make it accessible to everyone. So there were some ideas last night from the Washington group about, we should be building how to write a FOIA request into civics classes. Because now I look back, I'm like, gosh, I could have asked that question a whole lot sooner and demanded an answer. And then you think, oh, they're going to be annoyed or irritated. Oops, okay. That I wear that with a badge of pride. And I would say ask questions, ask them often, put them in writing, pester for the answers. And my FOIA request, literally, pursuant to Kansas 45-215, please provide me. And then I just list the documents. Like, it is not complicated. It's not, someone said, would you have to write it with all these other legal terms? No. FOIA is for everyone.
Any questions from the audience?
Hi, thank you all so much. My name is Margaret Kolka, and the last comment sort of provokes this question, which is, I think oftentimes it's easier in sort of law and policy or even academic debates for people to quantify all the various costs of FOIA, how much personnel, how much time, how many dollars, how much processing. It's much harder to quantify the benefits. And so sometimes when we're having debates about the various costs and benefits, there's sort of a disproportionate weight on the costs and not enough on the benefits. And I think in the public debate, that's often true too. It's so administratively burdensome. There's all this kind of government apparatus. Your stories are so inspiring. And I'm wondering, but nobody wants to be thrust into a situation where you have to use public records because the unthinkable has happened to find that value. Do you have thoughts or suggestions about how we can change law or policy or government or anything in a way that would make the value of transparency more salient to the public? Thanks.
Okay, so I'm definitely the least interesting person up here, but just to say in terms of what the Carter Center does and what we do in our campaign, we actually ask the city, what services do you have that aren't being used? Because women don't know about them, because they have the services for a reason. And so we let them choose which service to focus on. And that has been kind of the game changer. Because for them, I'll give the example of Kampala, which is in Uganda. They had received money, the city, from outside, including from the national budget, to do small grants for women cooperatives. But nobody was requesting the money because they didn't know it existed. They didn't know how to do it. So they were about to have to lose all of those funds. And no politician wants to give money back. They want to give it into their community. And so they said, let's focus on that. And within 6 months, they had 300 requests from women cooperatives for those grants, and they were able to give out $250,000. So it made the mayor look amazing. It made the city look awesome, but it also changed the lives for all those women. So in some ways, it's not it's not us being able to tell so many stories, but actually maybe asking different questions. Like, what is it that's meaningful for you as a government? How can information, getting more information out, actually help you to meet your own objectives and to achieve those goals?
I think sadly, how it saves money, like, or gains funds is a way to make it more salient. I mean, I don't love having to go down that road, but that's a reality. I mean, I know when my municipality put all the policies online, it saved their staff a whole lot of time because there weren't all these open records requests for copies of policies. So that's a tax savings for them and the staff. I mean, I'm sure their staff was, tired of getting those open records requests, not just from me, but from reporters and community members, that it really is an efficiency thing if they just make the information more accessible. And I think the average person appreciates that.
I don't know if this answers your question exactly, but from a journalist standpoint and, someone that's been dealing with like various agencies, I think standardizing, report taking would be really helpful because, an issue I'm running into is, race isn't accurately tracked. And so, Indigenous people are, slipping through the cracks because they were identified years prior as being white, or maybe they're just not even asked the question. But also, a lot of times in the data, this initial part of the project was focused on women, girls, Two-Spirit, and transgender people. Two-Spirit is a cultural term where a person, an Indigenous person, identifies as having masculine and feminine spirits. And obviously that's not something that's going to be tracked by a police agency, but they also do not track, transgender. And so and another thing I ran into was they do not track tribal affiliation. And that's really important for my project, particular in this issue in particular, because, again, there's 22 federally recognized tribes. There's over 500 in the country, and every community is different. And I think a key part of solving this is to figure out which communities are most impacted. But it's hard to figure that out if you don't know the tribal affiliations of, the cases that you're finding. And so that's like, those are just like holes in a lot of the records. And I think standardizing that with, police agencies that are taking this and these reports and, having the same sort of document and asking these questions would be really helpful.
For me, I think that one issue is, for example, the repository. The only reason I even knew that existed is because I worked at the library. So your average person is not necessarily going to know that that information is open and available. So I think maybe there's a messaging there that we can maybe shift to let people know that, that information is not only available, but they have a right to it.
We have a few more minutes for questions.
I didn't actually have a question. I was going to point out that the slide about the Missing Indigenous Persons Project, the QR code that I ran out on it, as I think a lot of people were trying to take it down. If you just don't mind, yeah, leave the URL.
And if you guys want to go back to the slide that has QR code and for you, and if you aren't able to drive it there, you want to go try to catch the definitely there. All right, I think this is a good point to end our presentation today. Thank you, ladies, so much for your